Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk ETC. I'm going to have a discussion today with my guest, Wassim Alsindi. He's done a lot of creative work in the blockchain space, and I think you'll find it enlightening. So welcome, Wassim.
Hey, Christian, thanks for having me, and looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, so people might not know that you spoke at the Ethereum Classic Summit, and I heard that it was well received. I wish I could have been there. Before we talk about that, I do want to get to what you talked about at the summit. Why don't you kind of give the listeners an idea of your background, career, education, whatever you want to share, and then also how you got into cryptocurrency, and then how you found yourself supporting Ethereum Classic at the summit.
Sure. I mean, we may have to take a few shortcuts along the way. It's been a kind of long and winding road. There's a lot of people that find themselves in cryptocurrency seem to have. So I grew up in England. My parents were from Iraq, and they came over in the late 70s, a little bit before I was born. They were very lucky to leave the country at that time. We'll talk a little bit about that later, I guess, because it's kind of relevant to some of the work that I've been involved in. Yeah, had a fairly unremarkable childhood, lived in the English countryside, went to the same secondary school as Isaac Newton, believe it or not, and then went to university, studied chemistry, did a PhD in photophysics, which is kind of the interaction of light with matter. So we were kind of frying molecules with energy and making them do exotic things. Then kind of segued into working in a university spin-out company, a company that some professors at the University of Nottingham, where I'd been studying, had been based. And then from there, kind of the road took a kind of sharp kink, and I jumped into my own kind of enterprises and own initiatives. So I started a business where just kind of trading things online. It's quite early for that kind of thing, I guess. Mid 2000s, we were doing that. And I was also kind of a hobbyist electronic musician, you could say. And the freedom that I got from getting off the academic conveyor belt gave me the time to pursue one of my lifelong dreams, which had been to run an experimental music organization. So I started a record label and started organizing events all around Europe and sort of touring around, doing all of this quite avant-garde niche activities. So that was a really fun one. And it was kind of a really strange chance occurrence during one of those activities that I stumbled across Bitcoin. It was summer of 2012, and I was touring the west coast of the United States with some friends, AFAST and Exelon, and we stopped at a friend's house, a friend of a friend's house, and he was an intern at Intel. So we stopped by his house in Santa Clara in Silicon Valley, and he opened his closet and said, "Look at this! I'm mining this thing called Bitcoin." And then, the inevitable flood of questions come, and then we go back off on our way. And so I just that was my first introduction. I went off and had a look into it. I was already quite into creative technology from my experimental music proclivities. But the whole thing seemed so crazy and far-fetched and a Wild West that I just spectated for a while until about early 2014, which is when I'd say that was my kind of Alice in Wonderland moment where I really started going down the rabbit hole and imagining the possibilities and the potential.
Now, I'm curious about something. So you said you were into music, and also you, of course, are talented, knowledgeable about science and technology. I'm just curious, do you feel like your musical experience somehow helps maybe give your brain a rest, or maybe helps it to then formulate new ideas when you're working in the blockchain space?
I think our brains are really complicated and wonderful things, and any kind of skill or different way you can interact with the world or yourself or what's outside yourself can help you in ways that you won't even understand or realize. This kind of notion of neuroplasticity. I think the more different things you throw at your life that you try to cram into your being, the more responsive and reflexive you might end up being. And so I have this kind of habit. Some people criticize me for it. That I'm often drawing analogies, like this cryptocurrency stuff. When you get to the nuts and bolts of it, it's quite technical, abstract, and complicated. And the way that we used to deal with those kinds of technical things in science and also in music was to use analogies, to use metaphors, and engage in that kind of creative storytelling to work your way around to the nitty gritty of how something works.
No, I think you're onto something there. I sometimes teach blockchain classes, and I use a lot of analogies. Like, for example, the idea of trustlessness, where nobody is behind the steering wheel in a public blockchain system. I often use the analogy that something we're more familiar with, where nobody is in control, of course, is like a free market system, right? Where everybody's actually focused on trying to take care of themselves. And nobody says, how am I going to improve my country's economy today? But yet the system works beautifully. It even works better than if you have like a communist system where somebody's intentionally trying to improve the economy. So that's one analogy that I use, and there's other ones. So yes, I think analogies are a great idea to explain.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think my favorite one, I actually saw it in a talk at a conference I was at recently, so I'm glad to see it's getting out there, is to explain how a hash function works, what it does to a piece of data. A meat grinder. It's a really great analogy.
Yes, I can see that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you take an arbitrary piece of data and you put it into your meat grinder, and you get something that's of a fixed size. So it and also illustrates the one-way nature of a hash function. I mean, you're not going to get a steak back out of your pile of mince, are you?
Good point. All right. So continue on from your story. So you're in California. You get exposed to this notion of Bitcoin mining, and then how did you grow from there?
Yeah, so we went on our way, and I think we had some more gigs and what have you that we were doing. I was actually traveling around, did a really long trip around the States. I think it was about 2 or 3 months, and I took the Amtrak coast to coast. So I was in the middle of lots of these very long, slow journeys, which were nicely soundtracked and very beautiful scenery, but they were very long. Like I was sitting in a cattle class for 35 hours at a time. No. It was an experience. What they say is true about the Amtrak is that the people on the Amtrak are the ones that don't want the TSA to check their bags. So you meet very interesting people.
Wow.
Very different kinds of interesting people, let's say. So I had a lot of time to think on that trip, and I guess it was just the possibilities and the potential. I think anybody that's kind of inquisitive will have thought, maybe when they were younger, 10 or 20 years ago, why can't we just have like a money that's like a digital calculator? Why can't we have a money just like email? I mean, it kind of makes sense. It's intuitively reasonable to expect natively digital money. So, I mean, the thought must have crossed my mind, so many times when I was playing primitive computer games that, wouldn't it be a nice way to kind of square the circle with all of these the nascent web technologies and internet technologies we had in the 90s. I guess I went home after the tour, and I looked into this whole Bitcoin thing, and all I really found was Mt. Gox, and I didn't like the look of that. So I got a big bag of popcorn, and I just sat on the sidelines and watched for about 12 or 18 months, something like that. There wasn't a great deal of really accessible information for beginners that was sort of just pervading the web back then as there is these days. So it was kind of hard to work out what was going on. Reddit seemed like a battle zone, and nothing much else was going on. So I watched the Mt. Gox hype bubble pump thing and the kind of implosion of it all. And when I noticed that Bitcoin had survived, a little bit later in 2014, later on in 2014, that's when I really started to pay attention to it as something serious, like a serious asset that is built atop a sound technology. And then I started to get really interested that this thing might actually have legs. It might actually be the thing that we have really needed, something to return sovereignty to the people and individuals, the communities, and disempower transnational organizations, corporations, governments, and so on.
Okay, and then so you became a fan of Bitcoin, and then what was the stepping stone to Ethereum and Ethereum Classic?
Well, yeah, I mean, actually, it was Litecoin first. I think I bought Litecoin before I bought Bitcoin, which is a bit of a jumbled up way of doing it. But there you go. I was buying them both at the start, and this was before Ethereum. I'm pretty sure. I think, yeah, I think I was hearing about the pre-sale back when I was really picking up some coins. I watched the Ethereum launch, and then I waited on the sidelines, and then the hype, the online chit chat, and the sentiment really just reached fever pitch. I remember, I think ETH hit $8, and that's when I realized that I had to FOMO myself into having a bag of ETH so that I could do X, Y, and Z. There was the talk of the Dow that was really interesting to me. And so it was really that, I think. There was the FOMO, and then there was the prospect of the DAO. That's what really captured my interest.
Did you invest in the DAO? I'm curious.
I was a DAO token holder, indeed. Yes, I was.
Did you like mortgage your house and bet the farm? Don't want to say. Okay.
I was no. I listen. I was an experimental musician. Experimental musicians are all broke. So we were just playing with monopoly money pretty much. But I had some DAO tokens. I was interested in the experiment, and I think I was on a very long trip when the well-known events that transpired concerning the DAO happened, and so I just remember continually having to resync my Geth client to try and sort out all of these refund contracts and withdrawal contracts and extra balance contracts, and I wasn't really on top of the technology back then, and it all seemed very complicated and onerous.
Oh yeah. In the early days, I mean, that's one thing I'm involved with is trying to improve the documentation. Yeah, so it's definitely a struggle to learn some of these the aspects of these Ethereum and Ethereum Classic, definitely.
Sure. I mean, I guess that's where things like light clients and web wallets and third-party things come in, because they put some lower steps in the difficulty curve, and then people that there was no option other to run a full node. That was your option.
Yeah.
So either your coins sit at an exchange or you run a full node. There was nothing in between.
All right, so you got interested in Bitcoin, and then you got fascinated with the technology of Ethereum, and then you heard about Ethereum Classic because you're involved with the DAO, and so then what happens next? So there's a couple of initiatives that you started. So why don't we talk about how that happened?
Sure. I mean, like that most of the stuff that's going on with parallel industries has really just been happening in the last 12 months or so, I'd say. Before that, I don't know. I was just kind of keeping myself to myself. I was still quite busy with creative stuff. Worked on a few startups and other projects. And so it was really at the start of 2017. I remember I set myself a New Year's resolution, and I think that resolutions are kind of stupid and only, they're kind of the sort of thing that weak people need. But I did it to myself, and it worked, because the resolution was, you're going to look at this very closely. You're going to look at all of this, these cryptographic networks, these cryptocurrencies, these blockchain networks, and so on. You're going to look at them closely, and you're going to try and understand them as best you can. And so I remember the winter of 2017, which was really quite cold in Europe. I was in Romania and it was -20. Then I was in Serbia, it was -25. And I was just sitting inside watching Arvind Narayanan and Andrew Miller explain cryptocurrency technologies to me. So I guess that was when it started becoming really something involved. Before then, I'd just been messing around on the exchanges and trying out smart contracts here and there, and made a colored coin back in the day, and just little experiments for fun. It was a science laboratory back then. There was no real kind of enormous valuations associated with things, so we were just having fun screwing around. It reminded me of being in the chemistry lab. Everything was sort of shiny and alchemical, and you could convert things into other things.
Now, I really want to ask you, so I looked at your website, and the one that really stuck out to me was your Reaching Everyone initiative. Can you describe that? I think people would like to hear about that one.
Sure. I mean, it's something really simple, and it's so simple that I wouldn't even really call it a project. Like you say, I think it's an initiative, just this open-ended idea that we should all be bearing in mind, which is that these technologies have the potential to help literally everybody on the planet. Like, we can help the people that need these things the most. They can have censorship-resistant money that can't be confiscated, it can't be debased, it can't be devalued. They can have resilient applications that run on smart contract platforms, things that governments can't stop running, that they can't take away their abilities or their functionalities. And so this is just a kind of a call to arms, kind of directed at the community as it exists today. Just to remember that we're kind of the 1 to 5% of the world. We've got all of the access to technology, and we're riding this tsunami of innovation. But we must make sure that we don't leave everyone else behind, that we don't just design tools for ourselves, and we don't have to get all kind of hand-wringing about this. People can act according to their rational self-interest and do this, because if the world widely adopts these technologies, everybody that has a stake or some tokens or some coins in these networks is going to be an enormous beneficiary of that. So people can act according to their self-interest and be nice and think of others. And that's what I like about the idea. It's a very positive one. It's a win-win positive something, not this kind of the usual way that we do things in the West, which is, poor people in the bush, let's go fix their worlds in our image. I think this is really about putting tools out there, getting developers interested, putting tools out there, putting attention to the problems that people might face, and then just build it and they can use it. I mean, if you travel anywhere in the world, people that have the less resources that people have, the more resourceful the people are. And I've seen incredible things myself. I've been very fortunate to travel quite widely, and I've just seen incredible things. People that have almost nothing by Western standards or first world standards, and the things that they can fashion with their bare hands and make happen and construct works of art or engineering marvels from piles of scrap that look useless to anybody else. It's just amazing. And so really the idea is to combine a whole bunch of really interesting ideas and projects that are going on in the space, and just to make sure that they do join the dots together. And we are seeing that it's happening. I'm not saying it's anything to do with me, but we are seeing it's definitely happening. So I just came back from the Hackers Congress in Parallelnipolis in Prague, at the Institute of Crypto Anarchy, which is quite a place, and they have an annual convention there, with a heavy focus on on cryptocurrencies and blockchain technologies, but also the kind of wider political ethos and movement around crypto anarchy and more generally using these technologies to re-empower individuals. And I had such a great time there. I met people that I could only have dreamt of meeting, a few months ago, and everyone is really receptive about this idea, just because there's no downside to it. There's no reason not to. So I spoke with some people associated with Samurai Wallet, which is a privacy-focused Bitcoin wallet. I spoke with some people associated with Gotenna, the mesh networking technology providers, and everyone's really interested in joining the dots to make a kind of resilient framework for people to be able to transact and use these things almost regardless of the situation. The people say, oh, if there's no internet, then cryptocurrencies don't work. Or if there's no electricity, then you can't mine Bitcoin or Ethereum Classic. Well, got news for you. Like, things will keep rolling, even if there's no power, even if there's no internet. Those transactions are going to go through, and blocks are going to get mined. Maybe less than if there was all the power you could consume. But I think these networks are extremely resilient, especially the ones that have a focus on censorship resistance, immutability, or resistance to change. However you want to frame that. I think those ones have this, enormous transformative potential to help people that find themselves either under-resourced or, at the, on the wrong end of some severe inequality, to help level the playing field. And I think that's something we've never had before. So just the idea is just to remind everyone that what we've got, what we actually have in front of us, and that potential.
So I have a simple question for you. So you're trying to help everybody, you're trying to increase access to cryptocurrency, blockchain technology. Do you see the smartphone being the universal gateway entrance to this technology, or is something else would be better?
I mean, ideally, it would just be whatever people have to hand, they can get on board. And I know that smartphones are one of those things that are proliferating around the world. I was in Myanmar, or the country called Burma, a couple of years ago, and this is a place that's been very closed to outsiders. So it was one of the last places to. It was the second last country in the world to have Coca-Cola in it. The last one is North Korea. So that's how closed off it was. And when I was there, the Chinese budget smartphone manufacturers that also pretty much ubiquitous in Africa, they were just they just got into Myanmar. So you go down a high street in a little town in Burma, and every other shop is a mobile phone shop. And people that live in, shack is probably, over exaggerating the grandiosity of their dwellings. But they would have a brand new smartphone, and they'd be downloading apps, and they'd be trying stuff. And the government had changed the price of SIM cards from about $250 each, which was something like 10 years' salary for the average worker, to $1 over the course of 12 months. So all of a sudden, everybody was being onboarded at once. So you can see in a situation like that, the smartphones really are becoming quite ubiquitous. But in places like Burma and in Africa, the requirements are a bit different. So if people have limited access to electricity, like plug sockets and reliable charging, then they're going to want phones that last much longer. So the best-selling smartphones in Africa last a week. Okay. But they still have, so they're halfway between what we have with these kind of 4G radios and Bluetooth and all this hyperconnectivity and big screens. They're halfway between that and the older phones that we had that we used to play Snake on, the Nokia feature phones. Right. So, basically, we need to make sure that there's always a way onto these networks. And one of the ways you can do that is with this idea of relays. So Samurai have been, and other people have been working on this open source tool set called mule tools. And like a mule that you send through the mountains to get a consignment of goods through, this is about making sure transactions get through. And they're focused on Bitcoin, but really these ideas can be applied to almost any of these networks.
Right. So is this a concern? The only reason, so smartphones are getting cheaper and cheaper, and that's great that it's penetrating every country in the world. The only reason I could see where you possibly maybe wouldn't, or one possible negative, is that the security of a smartphone might not be there. And for that reason, since you're concerned about privacy and security, maybe somebody somewhere, there's a startup that should be designing a really cheap hardware wallet, or almost like a credit card type, with a microchip that they could that was really secure, and had just very restricted connections to the outside world. Maybe somebody that wasn't that. Maybe is there an idea? Is there a need for that? Or
I mean, like the wider the plurality of possibilities, and the wider the price points and the complexity of those devices, the better. So what you're talking about sounds a little bit like what just came out as the cold card wallet by the same guys that made the Open Dimes, those little USB disposable Bitcoin wallets. And so the cold card it looks about the size of a calculator. But it's a kind of a cold storage Bitcoin hardware wallet that doesn't need a computer to transact, and you can write things to the SD card and then broadcast them later, or you can do a few other ways. So that kind of thing is an idea that could be applied to all kinds of cryptocurrency. You could host different kinds of cryptocurrencies on wallets like that. But the thing with all of these ideas is they're all physical devices. So that means that they can be taken away from you, or you could lose them. I mean, my last two mobile phones that I'm no longer in possession of, one fell in the sea in the Philippines, and the other one was taken from me at gunpoint in Bolivia. So,
oh my goodness.
Sometimes you don't always get to keep your phone. It's not up to you.
Okay, well now after that story, now it makes it sound like, in addition to hardware wallet, smartphone storage, then you would want what you were working on, right? A web-based system.
Well, I mean, the more tools you have at your disposal, the better. So I guess what we should come on to is we did a little hackathon project at ChainHack, which was the hackathon before building on Bitcoin in Lisbon and over the summer. And the idea was to try and think of a way that we could design a web wallet specifically for displaced people, for people that are undergoing migration or that are becoming kind of refugees. And so the idea was to find a way to take the idea of a web wallet and use it in a way that doesn't expose the subject, the person that's traveling, to undue risk of extortion. A way that they could easily access the wallet again, something that leaves no trace, and something that's empty even if it's accessed. So the idea is it's almost like a kind of zero. The idea was, I mean, it's a very low tech proof of concept we made. We're kind of like a zero knowledge wallet, something that has. There's no record of it. There's no trace of it on you. But even if somebody got into it, there'd be nothing in there.
So where are the keys actually stored then?
So the idea was that we would go through a kind of a Q&A process with this is before anybody's left. So if you imagine the situation, think of a village somewhere in the mountains, doesn't really matter where, and the would-be migrant is there with their family. And so you've got to put this in the context of what these journeys are kind of like. So people will leave their small little town in the mountains for any variety of reasons. Could be because they need a better life, for economic reasons. They could be political problems. There's all kinds of reasons why people might want to leave. So this is something that you would set up beforehand, a little bit like, what happens with the dynamic of these journeys is the family are kind of drip feeding or sending via drip feeding, not bank accounts necessarily, but things like sending money to Western Union points. And then the migrant would go collect that. and that would pay for a boat journey, or it would pay for accommodation and so on. And so that's kind of a drip feeding sort of model, where it's not like you send the migrant off with $50,000 tucked into his socks. That won't get you very far. So you have to have these kind of drip feeding.
Now, can you elaborate? Because I'm not familiar with that term, drip feeding. I'm still trying to see where the keys are stored. So maybe I'm missing something.
Yes. So I mean, the idea is, so just to say, I just wanted to make the point that everything gets set up before the migrant would leave, let's say. So basically, when everyone's at home, they're still at home in the village, they would go through this kind of personalized Q&A, and that would generate, and so the questions would be that they could choose the questions. Could be the name of the river, the name of the mountain, name of, and that thing, personally meaningful information, and mnemonic information, and then that would be concatenated, and you would generate the keys from there.
Oh, and so it doesn't have to be stored anywhere. They just have to answer.
Yeah. So the idea would be that the family would keep, a copy, and then the migrant would keep, either half or all of it in their minds, and then there'd be ways of transmitting that should they need to later.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing something interesting that I think I want. I think I get it. I get it.
But I mean, we didn't get that far in the hackathon, but we had this kind of idea to extend it a bit further. So, as it is now, they basically think of it as they've got one address that they share. Uh-huh. Yeah, it's anyone can spend. So you could think of it as a one of one, and they've both got access. So that means that either the migrant or the family could spend, and then the family would have another wallet, and then they would gradually send small amounts of money into the wallet that was shared. And then even if the migrant was to go offline, or something would go wrong, then they could always clear the balance and mitigate any of those drip fed losses. When I say drip feed, what I mean is kind of like when you've got a leaky tap and it's just dripping drop by drop, slowly and gradually. So you're not going to have a biblical flood if your tap is dripping. So you're not going to lose all of your money, but you can send small amounts as they're required. And so the extension to the hackathon project was going to be to set it up kind of like a two wallet system that would be generated from the seed that the Q&A would help you make.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, you gave me another idea, and I don't know if you've thought of this already, and maybe you have, but this Q&A idea gave me the thought that, so we all agree the most secure place to store your private key would be in your mind, right? You don't have to store it on a web server you may not trust, or a piece of paper, or a laptop or smartphone you might lose. So
for a limited time, yeah. I mean, depending on timescales here, like as long as we're not talking about years, I would agree with you.
No, but and so of course the practical problem is that a private key, the number is so huge. But I wonder if somebody could design an algorithm so that you would have maybe 20 questions, and depending on how you answer that, the algorithm there's a corresponding private key. See what I'm saying?
Yeah. So there's a project. It's not finished or implemented or in production, called Gramtropy, like entropy and grammar, or grammar and entropy stuck together. Those words stuck together, by Peter Wuller, the Bitcoin core developer. And there's a GitHub for it. So the idea was that you could use different kinds of grammars to generate seeds, and maybe if you used an approach like that, you could extend it further to kind of do what you're talking about.
Right. Because then you don't have to store the keys anywhere. Of course, I mean, it's on the blockchain, which is copied everywhere, and then nobody could ever steal that. I guess they could torture you to make you reveal.
Yeah. I mean, you also have to just be careful that you don't use such obvious answers to your questions. In other words, you generate enough entropy that your seed is going to be secure. Like I remember, your private key is going to be secure. I remember reading about people that generated insufficiently strong Bitcoin private keys, and all their balances got swept by some bot that was just going through cracking their password.
Right. So that's definitely an interesting project, a reaching everyone project. So why don't you now say something about what you gave your talk on at the summit, Forkonomy, where you're
Sure.
analyzing forks?
Sure, yeah. So this is kind of a bit of a quirky project. It was really just a shower thought that I had over the summer, and I kind of bashed out a paper in a couple of days, sent that to a couple of journals, to academic conferences, and to see what they said, and then the feedback was quite a lot better than I expected. So the idea is so Forkonomy, it's drawing an analogy with astronomy. The idea is to do some comparative analysis of network forks that share a common origin. So think about, Ethereum became Ethereum and Ethereum Classic, Bitcoin became Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash. And the reason it's interesting is that this is the closest you can get to apples comparisons of these networks. That these children that share the same ancestors are very similar in a lot of ways. Technically and technologically, but also in terms of their ledger history, transaction history, and event history. So these forks in the road are quite, they have some potential to give you some interesting data points.
And so what kind of things did you learn and what kind of things were you looking for when you were analyzing these forks?
So the most kind of interesting thing that we saw, that was the one that really sort of sparked off the idea in earnest. It was actually kind of the opposite of a fork. So if you think of what a fork is, here I'll just try to be a bit clearer, because these words get used without, sometimes a little bit willy-nilly, and it can be hard for people to follow along. So the idea of a fork comes from kind of computer science, open source computer science, and the idea is that you kind of copy and paste a piece of software and then develop it off in a different direction than it had been before. So the analogy with the path that forks into two paths is pretty apt here. Now, what I call that is a code-based fork. So that's the code, the computing language that describes that program or that network, and you're just kind of copying and pasting that and doing something else with it. It's kind of a static process, a bit like you copied and pasted the text off a website or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to contrast that with the idea of a ledger fork, which is where a live cryptocurrency network splits into two fragments, because those are extremely different phenomena. And the word fork is used in for both, so it is useful just to sort of delineate that. So what we're talking about here is kind of these dynamic, live cryptocurrency networks that are, building their blockchains one by one, and then something happens. Maybe across the network, there's more than one candidate block, and it's then kind of a race for the network to reach consensus and agree upon which is the block to continue building upon. Uh-huh. So one thing we found was actually this opposite of a fork, which was what they called a fork merge. And this was a combination of two UTXO sets, two ledger histories of cryptocurrencies, into one new descendant network. And those ancestors were Bitcoin and Z Classic, and the descendant was Bitcoin Private. And so what we saw here was quite remarkable, because they did a one-to-one kind of swap for both Z Classic and Bitcoin. You had 4 million coins issued for Z Classic. You had 16.5 million issued for Bitcoin, and that meant that you had 20.5 million issued for Bitcoin Private, which left only 500,000 remaining supply. So this coin was on the same schedule as Bitcoin, but it's effectively halving ahead. So they made a coin that's older than Bitcoin. And obviously that's impossible because Bitcoin's the oldest. But because they did this kind of Frankenstein's monster thing, we've now got a new data point on a possible future of Bitcoin.
And so that's interesting. So for whatever reason, they thought it was advantageous to carry over the old ledger history rather than just making a new coin, a new private.
Yeah. Okay. I think the idea was that they wanted to call it Bitcoin Private, and so the idea was you would give one of each of them to all the Bitcoin people, and that would try to get them interested, and it'd be kind of a way to
Right. Seed the new coin. Yeah.
Yeah, and also to kind of appear to be related to Bitcoin and have some legitimacy from being associated with Bitcoin, I guess.
Yeah, so there's certainly, I think Bitcoin has a big reputation. So yes, it's anybody putting Bitcoin in front of their new blockchain project, certainly that I could see that would be an advantage.
But yeah, what's interesting is that so we've got this new ledger with 20.5 million coins issued, 500,000 left, which means there's almost no mining subsidy. It's the token price is quite low. It's like $3 at the moment. It's 1.5625 BTCP reward per block, 2.5-minute blocks. So what that means, and there's no transaction fee market. The miners aren't really being incentivized to mine the chain. So what you've got is this coin, which is on Equihash, which is an algorithm that has ASICs, and you can rent enough hash rate to 51% attack this network for about $100 an hour.
Okay, so
just to say, until recently, this was like a coin with a market cap, inverted commas market cap, in the hundreds of millions of dollars.
Okay, so that means, yeah, they have the risk that every new coin has, right? That they start out with a small mining community, and so they're vulnerable. That's
sure, yeah. But I don't see a way out of it, like as things are for them, because there's no subsidy left to give to the miners. It's only going to get lower and lower. So with the analogy to astronomy, I called this network a white dwarf chain. So this is a bit like, when the star, like the sun, the way it works is nuclear fusion is going on inside it. That's where all the heat comes from. It's melting hydrogen to helium and then into higher elements and so on. But when that fire goes out, when it runs out of fuel, then everything just leaves. It's there's no gravity. There's no way for it to maintain its mass and its burning core. And that's what I see here. This looks like, to me, the nightmare future of Bitcoin,
where it runs out of steam and the activity slows down. Okay. All right. Now, can you also say something about you also did some work in researching and thinking about governance, which I know is something I'm interested in, and that's a big issue with
sure. Well, actually, let's bridge it, because I also at the end of my talk at the summit, what we I kind of had a little bit of you could say like a shopping list, which was things that I wanted to see on Ethereum Classic, or things that I thought were matters of concern, basically. And so one of them is governance, actually. So let's kind of segue into that. I'm just going to bring up my laundry list so I can see it and not forget anything. So I've got a thing about Dows, decentralized autonomous organizations, and that was one of the big experiments of Ethereum in the early days. This idea of making a completely leaderless organization that didn't have any kind of top-down hierarchies, and the promise of that is enormous. Unfortunately, the experiment that occurred on Ethereum in the early days did not go very well. I think a lot of people in the ETC community are pretty familiar with the details, and if they're not, it's been discussed a lot. There was an interesting panel at the ETC summit about censorship resistance and immutability, where we talked about this as well. So yeah, I wanted to make sure that DAOs hadn't been kind of removed from the ETC horizon for eternity, because I think they have a lot of potential. I mean, I'm not sure they're ready for prime time just yet, but judging by the experiments that are going on Ethereum with things like Colony, Aragon, and DAO Stack, I think there's a lot of potential there. And what's even more interesting is, now that ETC is getting some really quite high assurance, formally audited and verified sidechains, maybe getting some of these DAOs onto some of these ETC sidechains would be really interesting, because the nice thing about a sidechain is if something goes wrong, then you can just kind of tear it down and start again. It's not the main network.
All right. And so for the people that don't know, so a DAO, a distributed autonomous organization, is essentially a very sophisticated smart contract that runs on a blockchain. And the example I always use is like think about a Uber replace blockchain Uber, where you can replace the company with a smart contract, sophisticated smart contract that was handling all the functionality. And that's the hope, is that we can remove lawyers, paper contracts, and a lot of bureaucracy with software. And so is your idea then that DAOs would, your idea is that for governance, that we could make DAOs to handle a lot of governance, voting issues, things like that?
Well, I mean, we're really at the stage where I think lots of study and some research and some experiments need to be done, like much more considered than the very rapid deployment of the DAO, which happened on Ethereum, a few years ago. Really, this is something that we need to build it on sound foundations. We need to do a lot of experiments and see how these systems evolve in the wild, because we're going to have human stakeholders, there's going to be human participants, there's going to be autonomous participants as well, machines or computers or AIs. I mean, like the possibilities are mind-boggling here.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I just wanted to make sure that was one of my kind of laundry list for the ETC ecosystem. Just wanted to make sure that the DAOs weren't going to be consigned to history because of one particular event.
Right. You don't want it to have a permanent black mark. In other words, people to forget the potential of it.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I actually think that DAOs are really promising for ETC, especially if ETC is looking at itself as kind of an autonomous blockchain or something that facilitates machine-to-machine interaction. I think DAOs lend themselves really well to that.
Right, and let me help you to evangelize the potential of DAOs. So we were just talking about a governance, and one of the things that comes up is how would you do secure voting, and we all have the idea in our heads of how voting works, and you vote on issues, but because there's too many issues in a big country like America, we vote for representatives that make all the decisions for us. And there's that all or nothing, where you have a representative or else you have to be full-time focusing on politics. Now, with blockchain technology, we could make much more fine-grained, sophisticated voting systems where you could give a representative maybe some rights, some powers over some issues, but you could keep other issues control over those. What I'm saying is there's all kinds, there's a whole universe of sophisticated voting mechanisms.
Yeah, like there's also this idea of liquid democracy, which is kind of where you delegate your vote, you entrust a representative on a case-by-case basis. So imagine we're talking about the transport policy of our town. Well, you would get the person that knows about how the roads work. And if we were talking about the sewage system, then you would talk to the person that knows how that was built. So you use each expertise for what it's good for, which is kind of like what we're trying to do with blockchains, right? Use the blockchain for what it's good for, what it's suited to. And so there's all kinds of interesting ideas out there at the moment about how we might mesh kind of, let's say, blockchain governance systems, how we mesh them together. Lots of interesting things happening on Ethereum as well at the moment. Lots of experiments going on.
Yeah, so I didn't want people to write off the idea of decentralized governance, that's never going to happen, and Ethereum Classic's not going to be able to make decisions about various issues that come up, because as we just said, like you mentioned liquid democracy, there are these ideas floating around, and so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was actually one of my other laundry list requests to the ecosystem of Ethereum Classic was just to make it a little bit more clear to the world at large how decisions are reached in the network, all the different ecosystem of stakeholders in the network. Like how are they coming to agreement on how upgrades should be proposed and implemented? So it's always good to have that kind of as visible as possible so that people understand how decisions are made. I think it's really important.
Yeah, that's right. More, you can never have too much transparency when you're talking about. Yeah, definitely. All right, so why don't we wrap up by talking a little bit about the future? What do you plan on doing in the near future, and what are your hopes and dreams for Ethereum Classic and the blockchain space in general? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So what I'm working on right now is something that's been a bit delayed. It was meant to be done over the summer, but had some issues with the project and with the institution that it was being developed inside, which I've now left. And so that's a kind of a taxonomic framework for the classification and characterization of crypto assets, of these cryptographic assets. And the idea is, like, we all see these conversations in the news about, like, oh, I think that token X is security. No, token X is definitely not a security. And that's all related to how things get regulated by different governments. And really, the angle I'm coming from is that these crypto assets are not like anything we've had before. They're kind of hybrids of resources and protocol networks and assets, and it's hard to say that something is totally a security or it's totally not a security, or it's definitely a money or it's not a money at all. So I'm proposing this non-binary classification system, which is going to be developed through some kind of taxonomies. I don't know if you remember from high school. You might have remembered those periodic tables of the elements above the chemistry teacher's head. Those are taxonomies. Those are ways of understanding knowledge and classifying objects. So,
well, I was thinking more of Linnaeus. Why don't you go there, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes. That was the start of it all, right? Linnaeus was this. I guess he was Swedish. I think Carl Linnaeus, a biologist, and he was just the godfather of classifying stuff. He churned out thousands of pages of manuscripts in his lifetime, and this idea of what we have now with, like, Homo sapien and so on, the genus and species as subdivisions of natural life. That's kind of a taxonomic classification. But what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying not to fall into the pitfalls of what's come before, which is everybody looks at the mess of tokens and coins and protocols and does what I call the kind of laundry sorting, where they're like, oh, this one's proof of work and that one's a security and that one's an app coin, which is a bit to me like, those are my t-shirts, those are my boxer shorts, those are my socks. And I don't know how much you're really learning from that. So what I'm trying to do is I've built this kind of multi-dimensional parameter space with these three nominally, I've basically decided these are kind of orthogonal characteristics that can live on axes. And this then looks like a three-dimensional space, something that you can draw on axes. And I'm calling it token space. And these three characteristics are kind of looking at how much of a security something is, how securitized something is, how much of a commodity something is, and how much of a money something is. And so I'm just finishing the paper off at the moment. I was actually writing about Linnaeus in the periodic table today, so it's fresh in my mind.
All right. Now, one thing we never got to. So you said that your parents had escaped or left Iraq.
Yes.
Did that somehow affect their opinions of politics, and did that affect your opinion of crypto?
I mean, yeah, it only really dawned on me recently, but it's kind of been this cloud that's been hanging over, my head and I guess their heads as well. Not that we really speak about it that much. So they came to England, and they just had quite quiet lives here. Like they're retired now, and they had all the excitement they could have ever wanted in Iraq. I think more excitement than you could possibly want. And so having a quiet, steady life was all they really wanted. So when it was my mother's side of the family that had some political problems. So her father was brigadier general in the Iraqi army in the, goodness knows, 40s, 50s, and 60s, something like that. And so he was the head of the 1st Mechanized Division when a young gentleman named Saddam Hussein rose through the ranks and assumed control of the Ba'ath Party. And so if you're a dictator, any dictator worth their salt would get rid of the most viable threats to their supremacy. And my grandfather was unfortunately one of those, having had his hand in a few coups over the years. So he was a little bit of a targeted individual. So the story goes that my mother was 11 years old when the Mukhabarat, the secret police, came to beat down the door to take him away to the torture house. And so the story is that my mother and her younger brother were burying his rifles and his amateur radio transmitting equipment in the garden, in the moments leading up to the house being stormed. And had they found those things, they would have assumed him a spy. He was just a radio enthusiast, but to all intents and purposes. And they probably would have shot him on the spot. But as it was, they took him into one of these feared torture houses, and he was one of the few that came out with his life. Although he, by all accounts, was a changed man, not the stern militarist that he had been before, rather quite a haunted figure. And so my mother's side of the family took this signal as a sign of not being particularly welcome in the country, and they all left pretty much. Many of them spread to Jordan and Syria, the Gulf states, Canada and Australia and the UK, New Zealand, Australia, America, and so on. So, but really they had huge amounts of problems. They couldn't, think about if you live somewhere, you're from there, you have a house, you have family, your kids are in college, or you have a job. Those aren't kind of liquid relationships that you can just dissolve and disappear. You can't just sell your house in the click of a finger. So people's lives were completely turned upside down. My parents themselves came to England on their honeymoon. They got married, went to England, and my father may have the world record for the longest honeymoon ever because he's still on it 40 years later.
So I could. Oh, I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's all right.
No, I was going to say I could see where a story like that might make somebody just all the more enthusiastic about blockchain technologies and the concept of decentralization, right?
Sure.
Right.
But you know what? It was a story of two sides for me, because I was kind of a bit closer to the kind of, I would say, legacy anarchy sort of political view before, where I thought that the status quo was unfit for purpose and it just needs dismantling, and any structure needs to be dismantled. And now I look at all these structures around us, and they look so fragile and unfit for purpose anyway, that I'd rather focus on the positives, that we can build a new set of infrastructures and systems and monetary networks, and then the other stuff can just do whatever it's going to do, and we don't have to worry about that too much. But yeah, indeed, this thing kind of, your Genesis story being this crazy idea of having to flee a place with nothing, it surely, it informs your decisions. And I'd be lying if I didn't say it makes me feel better that I'm finally doing something. I feel like it's perhaps paying back some of my good fortune. I've had a very, very privileged life myself in the West. A lot of my extended family didn't have the same thing. So maybe I'm being a bit selfish here and assuaging my Western guilt too.
Well, I could see why you would be thinking about having some kind of wallet that that your assets couldn't be taken away from you no matter what happened.
That was the key thing that I've been trying to explain cryptocurrencies to my family for years now, and it finally clicked with my mother a couple of years ago when I said, "Do you remember the things that man did to your family?" And she said, "Yes." And I was like, "Well, if you'd had this, you wouldn't have been able to do that to you." Right.
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful story. Pretty powerful, argument for blockchain technology. So before we close, have we missed anything or anything else you want to add?
Oh gosh, there's so much more we could talk about, Christian, but I guess we should leave it there, and maybe we'll pick it up again in the future.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to have you on again. All right. Well, thank you, Wassim. Thank you for talking with me today. It's been very enlightening, and thank you for all the initiatives you're involved in, and just keep up the good work.
My pleasure. Just to sign off and say that if any of you are on Twitter, you can find me. You search for Parallel Industries or Parallel IND. That's my handle. And really always looking for people to collaborate and discuss all these different projects with. So get in touch.
All right, and I'll put that in the metadata too as well, your Twitter handle. So, all right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Pleasure. Bye.